A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
It's Neil Johnson with you, the Tuesday edition of 2020, and one of those conversations coming over this next hour. I might even just pause and say, strap yourself in, get ready for some things that are disturbing, but things that you need to know as a Christian believer. Because freedom to practice our faith in Australia is something we hold dear, and maybe sometimes we take it for granted. Globally, new data shows an increasing number of Christians around the world are facing high levels of persecution and discrimination because they are Christian believers. The new Open Doors World Watch List 2025 confirms a disturbing truth that the number of Christians persecuted has risen by 15 million just this past year. The number's now around 380 million believers around the world under some heavy persecution for their Christian faith. And as violence and authoritarian restrictions escalate in some countries, believers are increasingly forced underground to worship. Well, the World Watch List ranks the nations where Christians face the most severe persecution and discrimination. Adam Holland is the CEO at Open Doors Australia. Adam Holland is joining us. Hey, Adam, welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. It's a real joy to be with you.
Adam, before we get into details, let me just ask you to revisit what we mean when we say persecuted Christian, because if it's just a little slap on the cheek or if it's just a name-calling exercise, we don't really call that persecution. Those are some of the things and the realities we learn to live with. But what are we talking about when we say persecuted Christians?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. It's a great question because I think we read in Scripture, not just New Testament, Old Testament as well, of persecution of God's chosen people, the Israelites, and then followers of Jesus in the New Testament. And as you alluded to, as you spoke to in your introduction, that number is increasing. So what does it actually mean? What is increasing? Two broad categories that Open Doors categorizes persecution into is smash persecution and squeeze persecution. Now, those might be familiar or sort of new ideas or categories for some of your listeners, but really smash persecution is violent acts against Christians. So that's actors, local members of other religions, political parties, influential people, or not, just neighbors, family members, who come to the extreme conclusion that because someone follows Jesus, is following Jesus, they attack them, they kill them. We do see that smash persecution increasing, and then squeeze persecution is really the social, cultural, political pressure to not follow Christ. And so that can be in the form of legislation, or it can just be in the form of a family saying, well, we'll disown you if you become a Christian. So that severe and extreme level of persecution is sadly increasing, and significantly. 15 million is a significant increase from last year to this year.
There's 50 countries on the World Watch List, Adam, and that's not all the countries that persecute believers. Out of that 50, when we're talking smash persecution and squeeze persecution, what are we talking about here? The top 10 in smash persecution? Yeah. What sort of numbers? How do you break down the list? Where does it become squeeze, or is smash and squeeze all part of persecution in some nations?
That's right. Well, it's a great question. We'll talk about the top 10 in a second. I think in terms of the methodology, and I know this can maybe sound a bit boring, Neil, but it's actually really important. The rigor that goes into the preparation of the World Watch List is incredibly high. It's the 31st year of the World Watch List, and this year actually is the 70th anniversary of the global ministry of Open Doors. So Brother Andrew, many of your listeners would know the story or have read God's Smuggler. Incredible story, and just a faithful steward of the gifts and talents God gave him. Really had the heart for persecuted Christians, and then the World Watch List began the research and then the publication in the early 90s. And so both those categories are measured. So on-the-ground research, which is both quantitative and qualitative, gives a score, a measure, in different categories, subcategories. So in squeeze persecution, it might be, is it illegal to follow Jesus in this country or even in this region of the country? Smash persecution is the capture of data where there's known instances where violent acts were committed against Christians. So each country, and you're right, it goes beyond 50. We published the top 50, but sadly the number is much larger than that. And each country that's ranked has a squeeze and a smash summary that is those subcategories that aggregate up. And I do just want to emphasize, I've been in the ministry 4 years, and one of the great joys and surprises was the confidence and the quality of the World Watch List research. It's independently audited every year. There's great rigor that goes into the capture of the quantitative and qualitative data and really seeking to identify, was the main reason this occurred because someone follows Jesus? If they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, that's tragic, and those are things that we pray for and are conscious of. But for the research itself is the primary driver because they were a follower in Jesus. And so everything we read in the World Watch List ties back to that.
And you're leading the Australian arm of Open Doors, but there are bases for Open Doors around the world, and the information, the data that's being collected there, the stories of believers who are under persecution, those are flowing into your centres, and you do a wonderful job getting word out. For those who are subscribers to the Open Doors, getting a newsletter, regular updates, you'll begin to follow some of the things that are going on around the world, and you can do that at the Open Doors website, opendoors.org.au. You mentioned a 70th anniversary since Brother Andrew. Now, you just recently lost Brother Andrew. He made a tremendous impact. And back in those days when Brother Andrew got started, Iron Curtain days and smuggling Bibles, things were perhaps not even as severe as they are now. Is there any contrast from the beginning of Open Doors to what we might be seeing in the world today?
There is. I mean, he was such a faithful steward, faithful follower of Jesus, and we did celebrate the impact he's had in God's kingdom at his memorial service a couple of years ago. And for those that have followed Open Doors, have been part of the ministry for many years, I meet people here in Australia and New Zealand who met Brother Andrew in some of the countries you're referring to, where they were smuggling Bibles, or here in Australia and New Zealand. So he had such a great impact. And to your question, Neil, yes, I think the contrasts are significant. And I'll share this with you. I was speaking at a church at the end of last year, and a lovely supporter of the ministry of Open Doors and a real active member of that local church was chatting to me afterwards, saying that they had prayed for persecution to end early in their Christian life. And it resonated with me because I did the same, Neil. I had missed passages of Scripture. I knew them, but I had missed the meaning of them, to say, part of following Jesus is taking up our cross, that parts of the body will be persecuted and suffer for their faith in Jesus. And you think of Matthew 5, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I had just missed parts of that. And so persecution hasn't ended in the 70 years, and it won't end until Jesus returns. I think the severity of persecution sadly has increased partially because technology has changed significantly, and also the freedom that many that would oppose Christians are able to operate in now. So there's a number of countries. You think of North Korea topping the list again. It's incredibly dangerous to be a believer there. But in the top 10, you think of Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, many extreme countries where it's so dangerous. The severity of the impact on Christians in those countries has increased over time, largely because they can act with impunity. There's no threat that they'll be held accountable for attacks on Christians because the country doesn't support any faith other than a Muslim faith, or there is just no place for Christianity in those cultures or in those religions. So sadly, the severity has increased, and Brother Andrew himself reflected on that in some of the later years in his life, and all the more reason for the prayer and support for them.
You mentioned some of those nations that are in the top 10 on the World Watch list. Let me just count down, and we'll talk about number 1. At number 10 is Afghanistan, number 9, Iran, number 8, Pakistan, number 7, Nigeria. Eritrea comes in at number 6, Sudan at number 5, Libya number 4, Yemen number 3, Somalia number 2, and number 1, once again, on the World Watch list is North Korea. What makes North Korea such a brutal persecutor of Christians?
I mean, it's devastating to read the stories that come out, Neil. I think it's an example of where both smash and squeeze are extraordinarily high. So in terms of the effectively cult that exists there in terms of the political leadership, but that controls every aspect of life. And it's devastating to read of the humanitarian crisis, but Christians live in constant fear because if anyone finds out that they follow Jesus, forced into labor camps, killed, tortured, I mean, shocking. If they don't do those things, then they slowly, directly but slowly put the pressure to renounce Christ. And so we can't get numb to it because we read about it in the news, or there's worries about nuclear weapons or those sort of things. But if you really think about individual lives of God's creation, God's sons and daughters in that country, which has a rich heritage of Bible colleges and training, many, many years ago, for that to just have absolutely no place for the gospel, sadly, it still is at the top of the list.
Yes, and when you appreciate that at the beginning of the 20th century, revival in North Korea, that part of the Korean peninsula, had such a dramatic impact, and there has been a displacement of Christianity from there with a different religious ideology. And while the world thinks about political and military solutions for what might even happen with North Korea, the challenging thing is nobody seems to appreciate that the thing that the North Koreans are most paranoid about is having Christianity permeated amongst its people, because that to them is a huge threat.
A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
And our talkback line open on 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation as we talk about the persecuted church around the world. Our special guest this hour is Adam Holland. Adam is the CEO of Open Doors Australia. Adam, come back to my comment just before we had that short break. The thought that there are many Aussies, even Aussie Christians, even people who've been in church for a long time, who perhaps are blissfully ignorant that there are nations around the world that do brutally persecute Christians. We often will think of people in our own context not under that sort of brutality, but what are your thoughts about Aussies and the way we consider the issues around persecution?
It's a great question, Neil, and it's a big topic. Two thoughts spring to mind. One is I'm reminded in my own life, I won't say this is for your listeners necessarily, but in my own life, how quickly I can get lost in really what I would say is a comfort bubble in Australia. I think in terms of freedoms that we have, in terms of safety, and just things like wealth, there's challenges for us there to get past, to view God's kingdom for what it is. It's upside down. It's the first shall be last. And so I would say from my own discipleship journey, Neil, the depth and the challenge that I face in my discipleship to Jesus, when I think of those who pay great costs to follow Jesus, there is no bubble. There is no comfort bubble. I find that confronting and challenging, but I do find it inspiring because those persecuted brothers and sisters that are in our family tend to have a more eternal perspective. They don't want the best of both worlds. It's not like the government's going to provide everything for them or there's the dream job. They have hopes and aspirations, but they're oriented towards the kingdom. And that's challenged me in my discipleship journey, Neil, because it challenges me to go deeper on passages of Scripture. The other point that just springs to mind is even though Open Doors is 70 years old and there's other ministries that work with persecuted Christians that do great work, it's still largely unknown across the full landscape of the Australian church. And so, like me, there's many Christians who probably understood some of the passages or had heard of Open Doors or other ministries, but to really engage with it felt a bit sad or depressing or confronting. But there is so much hope and life in it because it encourages us to have that orientation towards God's kingdom. And it's just a simple reminder that even if we're ignoring it, it's still happening. It's still very real.
And as you say, when you are a para-church organisation, and para meaning working alongside the church, in other words, you don't have a denomination that is, on the shingle above your door. It's Open Doors. And if people don't connect in with either your organisation, and there are a number of wonderful organisations that look out for the persecuted church, but if you don't have some connection there, you're going to remain blissfully ignorant and in the comfort bubble because you've got to intentionally expose yourself to the sorts of stories that are coming out. And if you want to hear the stories about what's going on in nations, in some sense, there's a real privilege and opportunity to get some of those because you guys work pretty solidly on getting those stories out to your followers, don't you?
Absolutely. And I think that's the encouragement and the positively challenging part of listening to the stories of believers who are willing. It doesn't enter their mind to deny Christ because He's everything to them. And I would say the same, and we would say the same. It's just the cost that we pay is very different. I would acknowledge, and some of your listeners may have these thoughts, that it is changing in Australia, and so that's a question I often get asked in my role. And I do acknowledge that. I think there are challenges to being a follower of Jesus in Australia. Politically, culturally, all those are real. But on the spectrum of levels of persecution, we're so low down that often we don't have a real insight to what it means for someone to accept Christ means they lose their family, they lose their home. Even things like the rule of law. And in Australia, let's say we were discriminated against because we were a Christian. There's legal recourse to try to address those things, whether it would be successful or not. In so many of the countries in the World Watch List, there's no means by which you can challenge any level of persecution, whether it's legal system, police, any of that. You're marginalized. You have absolutely, in the natural, nothing on your side, but of course you have God.
And, we could go off on a tangent about the value of Christianity and the way that it has formed our Western form of government and our court systems, because, yes, we do have some recourse, and it's not all completely totalitarian, dictatorial. Our courts do give us an opportunity to appeal when we're falsely accused. That's another tangent. We won't go there, but let's take some calls. Anne is in Labrador. Hello, Anne. Welcome back.
Hello. Welcome back. Yes. Thank you. I am so pleased that I actually received the Open Doors prayer booklet, and even the booklet, the new one they've got more information on about what they are and what's happening in this new one that they've sent me. And so that gives me an insight into what is happening with them and in Open Doors. So it's been great that I've been able to use that in my prayer time, quite on a regular basis. And I missed it one time and I rang you people up. I didn't get it. And I said, please, can you send it? Because they sent the thing for gifts I can't do that now. I'm retired and I'm a pensioner, so I can only do sort of a couple, like I do Bible League for outside and I do Vision Radio, so I can't do everyone. But
and I think you're doing all you can do, and there might be a challenge for those who are not doing all they can do. But a thought or two here, Adam. You've got people like Anne, and if she misses getting that update on things that are going on, if she misses that way of getting a focus of prayer for the persecuted believers, she's feeling a little distraught about that. You've got a lot of very loyal followers.
Absolutely. And thank you. I love to hear your faithful prayer and the generosity that you've shown over many years. And we completely acknowledge circumstances change, and we celebrate and appreciate all that you do. And I think the prayer guide, you referred to it, it's such a helpful tool. I do this with my family. My wife and I have 4 children, and we pray through the prayer points and the countries listed in the World Watch List, because it gives you something to be reminded of and to know those are real issues that believers face there. And then when that becomes part of your practice and your habit and your rhythm and prayer, you feel it when you don't. So if anything ever doesn't show up in a prayer guide or anything, we always are happy to connect with anyone. You mentioned the website before, Neil, opendoors.org.au, but our phone numbers are on there, email, so we're always happy to interact with anyone. And I'm glad to hear it's such a blessing to you, Anne, and the prayer guide it is to me as well.
And wonderful to hear from you. Thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Let's take another call. Chris is in Melbourne. Hey, Chris, welcome along.
Good on you, Neil, and guest. Why don't you put Donald Trump to the test? Make sure that he's cutting all sorts of aid. Why doesn't he cut aid to those countries that persecute Christians the most? You can send someone like Bridget Gabriel to advocate on behalf of Christians, and that sort of thing. Cut aid to those who are persecuting Christians.
You're touching on something important, and some might think a little political here, but if you have leaders who are concerned about persecuted believers, then the use of economic pressure as well as whatever other threats you might be able to make could be effective. But Adam, what are your thoughts here for Chris?
It's a great question and a great consideration, Chris. I think Open Doors in Australia has done much less what I would call political advocacy over time, and that's for a variety of reasons, not bad at all. I think in Europe, particularly where Open Doors has just been present longer and operating longer, there's a number of great relationships with Christian members of parliament or elected officials. And you mentioned economic factors, Neil, also diplomatic. Things like free trade agreements, when those are negotiated between countries, if those countries persecute Christians, those topics should be raised, we feel, in those discussions. So globally, Open Doors actually does quite a bit. It's probably more in Europe. You mentioned America. It's probably less in America as well. But I would share this with you. This year, I sent a copy of the World Watch List to members of Parliament, our federal members who I know to be believers and followers of Jesus. I sent them to other key members of cabinet, of senators and ministers, to acknowledge that persecution is happening on our doorstep. The 380 million, where the number's gone up, a lot of that is in Southeast Asia. And so we do a lot of trade. We engage with them regularly. So we want to do it carefully and respectfully, which we are. We do want to acknowledge that political leaders should care about human rights, and that includes the lives of Christians that are persecuted. And so where they can raise that, we hope that they do.
Chris in Melbourne, thanks for raising a really important point and for bringing out something there which may be an aspiration for the year ahead of how our politicians are responding to issues around Southeast Asia, where there are some severe persecution issues that are in play. Adam, let's talk about some of the movements that have happened in the top 10 or in the top 50 this year on the World Watch list. We know that North Korea is still solidly in number one position because of their brutal persecution of Christian believers. What other movements can you identify on the list this year?
Yeah, it's a great question, Neil. It's lovely to be back. I think interestingly, the top 10 has not changed in the countries themselves, but some of the order has changed. And so as that research is conducted each year, if there's more killings of Christians, sadly, or there's new laws that are passed or other dynamics change in the countries, they actually move up. So Yemen has moved up. Sudan has moved up. The top 10 itself is still countries that would be familiar to most of us: Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Nigeria, Eritrea, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and then North Korea, as we've discussed. In some ways, it's challenging when they stay the same because it feels like, oh, well, it must be the same as the year before. But the scores are increasing. So the severity of persecution across the board is increasing. And so that's the reality that Christians face in those countries, which continue to be so extreme in the top 10 particularly.
Let me ask you about a couple of names of nations that appear in the top 10, and Iran is in there, and Yemen. Those two nations have been particularly in the news because of the war in the Middle East around Gaza, Israel that was under attack from that dreadful terror attack, and you've got these nations that are in that top 10. And we don't want to at all take any of the weight of the seriousness away from the persecution that comes upon the Jewish people. But secondarily, in all of that, we might note that those two nations, Iran and Yemen, are in the top 10. They've been a part of that. The Houthis, as rebels, sending those missiles over into Israel. Christians are also under levels of persecution here.
Absolutely. Yes. I think often secular media is focused on particular things, and we know that, we understand it, but it is why ministries on the ground working with persecuted Christians are so important to draw us back and remind us that Christians are already persecuted in those countries, and when you're already marginalized, often it gets worse when there's armed conflict. Yemen itself is just an incredibly violent place. There's an ongoing civil war. You mentioned the sort of rebel forces there. There's many, many Christian house churches that have had to stop meeting because of that. There have been deaths of Christians. Again, that's largely by family members. So when someone accepts Christ, that's how severe the response is. Iran is a very complex geopolitical place, as we would know. But you're speaking to the general instability in that region. And we, as staff, we regularly pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters in that region because there's so much history, incredible legacy and heritage. But it's been fraught for thousands of years, hasn't it? I think to have a view towards Christians, imagine being a Christian in those contexts where you're already pushed to the side and then you're pushed even further through armed conflict. So sadly, those countries and others in that region, we see persecution continue and even increasing.
Stay with Iran for a few moments because other word that comes out of Iran, and we're talking about the persecution of Christian believers in Iran right now, but we've been hearing all sorts of stories about revival in Iran, about churches that are growing dynamically and with almost like a let's return to the book of Acts type of model of house churches and an underground meeting of believers and even public meetings of believers too. Got any insights at all that come out of those thoughts about what's been going on in Iran?
Yeah, it's a great reminder, Neil, that God's at work in every country. He's there. drawing people to himself. And Iran's absolutely an example of that. It has been harder to get some of the information out in recent times, but what you've said is absolutely true. I've met two Iranian believers in the last year. An incredible testimony of where there's a vibrant underground church that continues, and I think to be reminded for even them of the revival that's occurred, of a real drawing of many, many people to himself, God drawing them to him, is a reminder for them to not give up. I think the regime there is getting worse in terms of how they publicly try to position things to look a certain way, but in the quiet and the sort of secretive way of persecuting Christians, that's absolutely continuing in such an extreme way. But it's a great reminder, God is at work, and we do hear that out of Iran. We hear those stories of where those that have come to Christ and others continue in their faith, but completely underground.
You have the wonderful privilege of being the recipient of a lot of amazing stories of believers who are able to be sustained, let's say, by God's power during the most severe persecution. You've got stories from nations that are on the top 10 list and beyond. What about the nation of Pakistan? That's another nation that, sometimes it's in the headlines, not as much these days. What are your thoughts about what's happened in Pakistan?
Yes, it's interesting to have countries that we're familiar with, but to actually ask the question, what would it be like to live there? And I've not traveled into the country, but I have met a number of Pakistani believers, and it's one of the very few countries in the world, watch this research, that has a maximum score for violence. And that's been consistent really since about 2016. There's been extreme versions of violent acts against Christians in that country. Some of those have been reported in the news, but often they're not things that get reported because they're just normal, Neil, but they shouldn't be normal. And I met a persecuted brother 2 years ago, and then last year again, Brother Haroon, we'll call him, and he paid an incredible price, terrible price for coming to faith in Jesus from his family, his immediate family, from the Muslim leaders in the country, in the region that he was in the country. And his story is an example of where, after multiple attempts on his life, he did flee the country. And so that isn't always the case. So many Christians stay. For a number of reasons he did. And as he shares his life story, I can't go into it all, but a terrible cost in terms of his own health, in terms of impacts on his family, the shame that was brought on him because he became a Christian. But if you met him, Neil, if you met him in a cafe or at a conference, you would see a vibrant, faithful follower of Jesus that declares as a faithful witness and testimony to God's work in his life. And that's both because of, despite, but also because of all the pain that he's paid in persecution. And that was such an encouragement to me that he does minister back in Pakistan, so he has to do that remotely. But again, a bit like Iran, where people question things they've been taught that are not respectful to human life. And in his case, that sort of led him to really understand Jesus more. And he ministers back in Pakistan to those who are going through something similar. Still has threats on his life, but faithfully declares Jesus, which is encouraging.
And when you say in nations like Pakistan, they've got a maximum score for violence, some might be saying, well, don't they have any law and order? What do the courts do? How does Sharia law work to protect anyone? Because as I understand it, even though someone might be taken before a court on a charge, whatever the court decides may be overturned by the mob on the street. Any thoughts here about how believers stand up and stand strong under any of those sorts of situations? It seems almost impossible.
Yes, there's a number of countries. So what you spoke to is, I think, a really important point. There's a number of countries where theoretically there's a framework or there's a system by which human rights that are violated can be raised, but whether that's actually practiced and enforced is a completely different question. And so this is true in Pakistan, where the religious framework by which the legal system operates in simply means that there will be no repercussions for those who take violent acts against Christians. That's the consistent testimony of believers there. But many other countries, that's true for many other countries in Central Asia. Often it is countries that are Muslim-majority countries where the political system is tied to the religion. You sort of spoke to it before. And so some of them exist theoretically, but in practice there is no basis to have a fair hearing, to be judged by peers independently or objectively, or even the judicial system. It just doesn't exist.
When you have blasphemy laws that are in place to protect religious ideology, as so often happens, especially in those nations where there is Sharia law and Islamic rule, that puts everybody else on edge. Everybody else is then vulnerable. So those sorts of laws, I guess, need to be resisted, where there's even talk about those sorts of things and similarities in different laws around sexuality and such things in Australia. But those sorts of things need to be resisted, don't they? Because they create an imbalance. They create second-class citizens.
I agree, Neil. I think a power imbalance is a great way to put it, because what often we hear the stories of Christians who have completely fabricated accusations made against them based on blasphemy. Because the people that bring the charges or make the claims, they know that the system will, in a sense, reward them for that. It will be them doing something for their faith or sort of attacking these Christians who are already marginalized. And so in some ways that legislation emboldens those people that might be, highly critical or hate Christians to make a claim of blasphemy. And then that's taken very seriously, extremely seriously. And that is where Open Doors, some of the funds raised do go to work for legal representation in some instances, or just support. Sadly, in many of those countries where there's blasphemy laws, they're written so one-sided that there is no real chance to challenge them. Just by virtue of challenging them, it almost makes it worse. We do pray about that, Neil, because as more countries roll that type of legislation out, it creates a great power imbalance.
Power imbalance for drinking from the wrong cup, or you didn't handle the Quran book with the right amount of care, therefore dragged before the courts and on a legal charge. Those sorts of things certainly are challenging. Hey, when it comes to the issues around persecution and our feeling about that here in Australia, let's come back to this just for these last few minutes, because some listeners to our conversation today are going to say, well, how do I get involved here? How do I understand the context of what's going on in the world and not just my own backyard? Come back to what's on offer when people go to the Open Doors website, opendoors.org.au, just simple access to the World Watch List. There's no charge for that, as I can understand. I can't see any charge for it. It's free. You can actually access that, and you could click on any one of the 50 countries on the World Watch List, and you can find out detail about what's going on there. Tremendous resource just having the website. Absolutely.
I think in terms of the global ministry of Open Doors, it's encouraging for any of your listeners that might not have engaged with it already to see the incredible work that's done by the ministry and other partner ministries. And I view those as testimony of God at work in all those countries. If there were not Christians there to be persecuted, there wouldn't be the need to work there. But there are those that are faithful witnesses to Jesus around the world and in the countries where it's the most dangerous to follow him. The website has great resources. You can sign up to newsletters, prayer guides that are sent out regularly. We do see the need increasing, Neil. So I think in terms of those who have the opportunity and the capacity to support financially, we directly support so many Christians that face persecution around the world. The ministry is focused and dedicated on being alongside persecuted Christians, which does require financial resource. We welcome anyone's generosity in that regard. We absolutely equally welcome prayer support. That's the origin of the name. Anywhere is open. All doors are open through prayer. And so anyone interested in getting more involved, I would really encourage them to engage with the website. There's lots of opportunities, as well as the local church. If you're, I'm sure many of your listeners, or all of them, are parts of local churches. We would love to be able to partner with the churches to add to the discipleship journey those churches are already on, with persecution awareness as part of that.
And they're a wonderful group of believers who are long-time supporters of Open Doors, and from time to time there are special appeals when there's something that is going on that needs special attention, and the call for extra donations to make those things happen. No doubt there'll be a number of those sorts of appeals that'll be coming up through the year, and we'll try and keep listeners abreast of those. Adam Holland, I want to thank you so much, just sharing your heart with us today, giving us those insights around the World Watch list, and for listeners to be able to access that at opendoors.org.au. Get onto whatever subscriber mailing you can get onto to be alerted to the things that are going on around the world. Oftentimes it's Open Doors who'll have those stories coming to the fore even before the headlines are there, even in mainstream media. So take advantage of opportunity to be connected with Open Doors at opendoors.org.au. opendoors.org.au. Adam Holland, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today on 2020.
Neil, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.